Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from AlexMercedCoder.dev. And don't forget devnursery.com, and don't forget to check out docs.devnursery.com, where there's a lot of really cool resources. You just click here on New Dev Docs, and you can find a bevy of resources and articles about anything you'd want to learn programming-wise, especially if you're sort of a newer programmer looking to really beef up your understanding of things. But what I want to do today is talk about Flexbox and Grid. They're two of the most important things in CSS when it comes to kind of really being able to kind of get nice and flexible layouts. So first, let's just kind of set up our stage here. So what I'm going to do is first, we're going to set up a we'll do a flex.html, okay? Because the idea is that this is going to represent a Flexbox example. So first, we're just going to set this up. I'm going to use Emmet to set up my HTML boilerplate. So there it is. And the way I usually like to demonstrate this, and I'm going to open this up with live server so we can see what's shaping up. So right now we have a blank page. I'm going to put a style tag down here so that we can write some CSS right here in the same file. Okay, but what I usually like to do is I like to have a div. So we're going to call this the container. So actually I'll just use Emmet to write this, div.container. Okay, and then generally what's going to happen here is that I'm going to have 4 divs. Okay, so we're going to say div.square .1, div.square .2. Okay, and you'll see that we have 4. So basically, we have 4 each div. Think of as a box. Okay, every block element think of as a box. So I have a box with boxes inside of it. This is generally what's important when it comes to like Flex and Grid. Understanding that what Flex and Grid does is just going to change how the container, so that div that has a class of container, is going to change how that behaves, how it's going to treat all the blocks or squares inside of it. Okay, so div.square.3. and div.square.4. Okay, so there's our setup. Okay, so right now you don't see anything because by default, an empty div, which has no content in it, isn't going to show up on the page. So I'm just going to put like a in all of these. Okay. Cool. So now you can see that these 4 divs exist, and you see by default that they all stack on top of each other. That's the natural default behavior of blocks within the same level. So all 4 of these blocks are inside of this block, and by default, they're just going to stack up inside. Okay, Grid and Flex are going to allow us to change that behavior. And again, those blocks could be a section where you put a menu or a section where you have an image. Those blocks are your building blocks for your website. Okay, but I want to make this a little bit more visual so you can kind of see those blocks a little bit better. So what I'm going to do is we're going to first style the container class. And we're going to give this a background color of Blanche Diamond, just so that way it stands out a little bit. Okay. And we're going to give it a width of 700 pixels and a height of 700 pixels. Okay. And maybe a little bit less. Let's say here 500. Okay, let's make it 600. 600. Okay, and then we have this nice square. I want to get that square centered. So what I'm going to do is change the margin to auto. That'll center it. So auto, and that'll center that square there. Good. Okay, because generally when you have a block element, an auto margin will automatically set enough margin on the right and left to center the block. Cool. Okay, so I have this block, and we have the 4 divs inside of it, which you see are inside the block. So you see these blocks are inside that block. Okay, and I want to make those blocks more visible. Okay, so we're going to, all of them have a class of square, so we're going to style that square piece. And we're going to make each of those have a width of 250 pixels and a height of 250 pixels. Okay, so you're going to see like that's going to change a little bit. See, now they're starting to break out. But it's still not quite super visible, so let's give them a border. A border of 2 pixels solid black. So that way you can see that these squares exist. Okay, there they are. Okay, so these squares exist. Right now they just stack on top of each other. Technically all in that almond square, but, you know, basically stacked on top of each other, they're bigger than the square, so they're breaking out. Okay, so not necessarily what the effect that we want, but again, the idea is to kind of demonstrate how this works. Okay, so we got that. Now, cool. And then I'm going to want to give each of these squares just a separate color so we can kind of distinguish them. So dot one, we're going to give a background color of aquamarine. And actually what I want to also do is change the font color in here. So the color of the font. And we're going to use RGBA, the RGBA function. So that way I can just do, we'll just say 255, 255. It doesn't really matter what the color is, because then what I'm going to do is put 0 as the last marker, which makes the font invisible. Okay, so that way you can just see the square. Okay, cool. So now we just see the square. Now we're going to give each square a separate color. So next will be 2. Background color, we'll make that one blue violet. Okay, and we'll make the next color 3. Background color, make that one, let's go with steel blue. And dot 4, background color, make that one brown. Okay, looking at this, I do probably want to make these a little bit smaller, so I'm going to make these 200. Okay, and there we have our squares. So we have our squares. We see that the squares are inside of the block, so we have squares inside of a square. Because of the square's height, they're breaking out of the square, and that's going to be the deal there. So I'm going to copy this, and I'm going to paste this, because we're going to do another example for grid. Okay. I'm going to rename this grid template. And then I'm going to name another one called grid areas, because we're also going to go over grid areas. So rename grid areas. Okay, cool. Okay, so first let's focus on flex. So bottom line is, when you want to change the behavior here, basically we have to change the behavior on this block here. Okay, so the thing, we want to change the block that has the other blocks inside of it, and that's going to change how these blocks get treated. Okay, so that's the container div. Okay, so again, this almond block is the one that has the class of container, and what we do is we change its display property. Its display property is going to change how it handles the other containers or the other blocks inside of it. So if I change this to flex, watch what happens. See, now they're all kind of by default stacked in a row. Okay, so basically now its default behavior is not to stack them in a column, but to stack them in a row. And when it does that, it uses the space available. So notice that now they're scrunched. Even though I had set an absolute 200 by 200 pixel size, it still squeezes them in that 500 width or that 600 width. Why? Just because that's how flex behaves. And again, by default, now it's stacking them in a row. I could change it back to a column. So I can go display, well, it's actually flex direction. Flex direction, and I can change this back to column. That way it's still a flex box, but now it stacks things in columns. And again, it'll squeeze it in that space. So flex box will naturally keep it within that space. So that's one benefit right there, that we're going to make sure that we keep stuff sort of within our container when we make it flex. Now I don't want to make this a flex direction column. I want to keep it flex direction row. Okay, nice. Okay, so maybe I don't want them all in the same row though. Maybe I want it to have like an overflow where it goes on to the next row. So typically if you go to like a website, like I always like to use the example of Zappos. So if I head over to Zappos and then we go take a look at, like, here we go, let's say shop sale sneakers, because it's like Saturday after Black Friday. So we just wait for that to load for a moment. Okay. Things take a lot to load when a lot of people are hitting the same website, you know. Okay, maybe not click on that one. Let's see here. Where else can I click? Let's click over here. No. How about over here? Yeah, we go. Men, shoes, boots. Why not? Let's take a look at men's boots. But you notice, see, you have these. So each of these is essentially a block. So think of these like, and then this, even though you don't see a visible block, this larger white square that contains all these individual cards is the container. Okay, and you see like they wrap around, and then if I were to stretch this out, it goes from 2 per block, eventually should change to like 3 per block, and there you go. See 3, then 4. Okay, it automatically adjusts. How does it do that? Well, we can do that with Flexbox. So if I go back to Flexbox, let me stretch this back out so that way we see the, there we go. I can change the flex wrap property on the container to wrap. Okay, and what that's going to do is it's going to allow it to wrap. Okay, so now it's wrapping. So basically, when the items exceed the width of the container, it'll start wrapping the items. Okay, cool. Okay, and the thing is, you can change that wrap to a couple different things. So like if I click over here, you can see that I have wrap reverse. If I wanted to wrap it in the opposite direction. So if I change this to wrap reverse, you'll see color-wise, it's doing it in the opposite order. Okay, and then if I change this back to wrap, okay, and then it goes back to its sequential order. So there's lots of things you can kind of do there. Now notice that they're all kind of flush to the left. By default, there's a property called justify content that only works for flexboxes. So this property is only useful if the container is a flexbox. But what this does, it's going to allow on the main axis. So the main axis right now is the row, because by default flexboxes are aligning things by row. It allows me to kind of choose how that horizontal alignment is set up. So I can choose center, and it'll center the items. Okay, I could choose flex end, which will align everything to the right. I could do flex start, which aligns everything to the left. I could do some other really cool ones like space around, which puts an equal space around the elements, which is very useful for different situations. Space between, which puts all the space in between. So basically no space at the very ends, just the space in between the actual elements here, as you can see here. And notice how it pushes the two, when I have 2 items on the same row, it pushes them off to the side. That's how you can get the effect of, like, if I go back to Zappos, let's make this big for a second, go back to the top. So notice how there's this section over here on the same row as this over here. How do we create this space in between? Well, oftentimes this row here is probably a flex box, and then this is one block in that flex box, and then this is another block in that flex box, and then when you put all the space in between, you create this gap. Okay, and then these are 2 blocks inside of that block, and so forth. So oftentimes you can have a flex box inside of a flex box inside of a flex box inside of a flex box. Okay, to get really cool alignment effects. Okay, but those are the kind of different options I have there. So that's essentially how Flexbox works. It basically allows you to dynamically handle how you handle all the child elements of the container. Okay. Still recovering from a cold, so apologize. But yeah, that's pretty much a good sort of getting started with like Flexbox kind of overview. So now you know, the basic bottom line is what you are changing is the behavior of the parent box. And notice all these changes I made, never did I change 1 or 2 or 3. There are things you can do. There are flex attributes that you can put on the flex elements, meaning the blocks inside the block. So there's things like flex grow. Okay, what this does is it's going to change just basically how they sequentially grow. So let's just try a different property too. And you see like that one, basically what I'm saying is saying that element is going to be 2 times the size of other flex elements. So see, now it's double the size. I can do flex shrink, which is just going to be the opposite. So I'm going to say twice. Okay, which doesn't really have too much of an effect there. So let me see if I do 0.5. No. I think that'll probably have more an effect if it's not the first element. So let's try that out. So if I go flex shrink. Okay, yeah, not too much of an effect there. But there's also flex basis, which also has a effect of changing how it like sizes relative to the other ones. So if I make a flex basis a 2, okay, in this case, it doesn't have too much of a difference. They basically flex basis, flex shrink, they tend to revolve around the other relative items. You can also actually change your order here. So let's see here, if it goes flex, shrink, flex flow, flex grow, flex wrap. flex order, but I think there's like a separate flex order, flex basis, flex string, flex direction. Well, flex wrap would belong to the container. Flex direction, that belongs to the container. Flex flow. Oh wow, I don't remember the exact property off the top of my head. But bottom line, like that's how you use Flexbox. And the way I think about using Flexbox is anytime I need to define a row, that's a Flexbox. So usually what I'll do is when I get to a section of a website, so if I'm starting from the top, like to me, this is one row of the website. So this is one Flexbox. And then when I look at it, I really only see like one div inside of it. I see like this div here, and then that would just be one item that just gets centered. And then here I would do the space between effect. So this would be a separate row. So you see like it's just a bunch of flex boxes stacking on top of each other. And then I would put in the content in that flex box. And then each flex box I would just kind of figure out what goes inside of it and style it separately. Okay. And then this flex box with all the items is just one big giant flex box that just dynamically has all these items inserted in it by my JavaScript. And then it's able to handle, 5 items, 10 items, 30 items, because the Flexbox can do that. And that's generally when I want to use a Flexbox. Oftentimes when the number of items that are going to be children are unknown. Like I just don't know how many Flex children there will be. Flexbox is going to be much more easier for handling that unknown number of children. Okay, so great for like, product cards. So that's Flexbox. Now let's talk about Grid. Grid kind of solves the same problem from a different approach. I find Grid more useful when I know the exact number of spots. Okay, I know there's a number of children and I want to have them not just lined up sort of unilaterally. I want them to kind of be all in different spots in different places. Okay, so with Grid, we'll start off with Grid template. Okay, so I'm going to close this and I'm going to open up the Grid template one, open with live server. Okay, so once again, we see that before I make any changes to the CSS, the container is just by default, which is referred to as display block. Okay, that's the default behavior. And this can be done with any block element. Now what happens is that it breaks out. Now first, let's just make the first change where I just change it to grid. So we'll just say display grid. And by just that change, I've made this into a grid. The thing is that nothing changes. Why? Because right now I haven't defined the grid. Because essentially the way grid works is you literally define a grid. You define a number of like rows and columns that you can then put things in. Okay, so in this case, I'm going to want to open up DevTools so you can kind of see this in effect. Oh, not there. Control-Shift-I. So if I go over here and I hover over the parent block, okay, if I click on it, see, it notices that there's a grid. And by default, it's just going to create the grid based on what's inside of it. So notice that there's 4 items. I didn't really define anything else, and by default, things get stacked on top of each other. So it just thinks what I want is 4 rows, and that each of those divs get their own row inside of that container. Like it's just basically like okay, that's probably what you want, I guess. For grid to really be useful, you need to tell it what the grid looks like. So I can do something like this. Okay, we'll say we can define how many columns and how many rows. So we can say grid template columns. And now what this allows us to do is say, okay, how many columns there are. So in this case, what I want, I'm defining the size of each sort of column. Okay, so I'm going to say I want there to be 2 columns. And I want them to both be equal width. So what you do is you do 1 FR, 1 FR. Now what does this mean, FR? It means 1 fractional unit. Okay, so 1 fractional unit. So what it does is that it doesn't actually have any absolute value. The way it works is that you would take the width. So the width of this is 500. Okay, 600. The width of this is 600, and you divide it by the number of fractional units. So there's 2 fractional units total. So the assumption is that this basically 600 divided by 2 is 300. So there's a 300 square here. So again, if I hover over that, I choose a container again. There you go. You see 300 by 300 spots. Okay, I see 2 columns that have a 300 width. Now again, I haven't told it anything about rows, so it's just gonna base the rows off, okay, well, I have 4 elements. I can fit 2 of them in the first row because the first row has 2 columns. So I'm gonna assume that the next row has 2 columns and there's another row. Okay. Again, it's going to try to figure things out based on the context you give it when you don't give it all the details. Okay. And then what I can do here is say grid template rows is find the rows, and I can do the same thing again. I want 2 rows of equal height. So 1 FR, 1 FR. Okay, so the first row is 1 fractional unit. The second row is 1 fractional unit. Cool. And now I have 4 perfectly defined grids, okay? And the way it works by default, these lines get a name of like 1, 2, 3. So let's see here. Like if I see this little button right here that says grid, if I click on that, it'll actually show me the names of the numbers. So you can see here, the line, this line is 1, this line is 2, this line is 2, and this line is 3. And vice versa, it's 1, 2, 3. Because now I can actually change where, so right now it's just putting them in order. So saying, hey, putting turquoise first because that's number 1, then 2, and 3. But what if I want to have this square, like I want to have this element over here? The grid gives me that flexibility. I can go back to the brown one and I can say, okay, well, let's say here, grid rows. Okay, in this case, now the difference between grid template rows means you're defining the grid. Grid row is saying, I want this element in that section. So I'm going to say, hey, I want this in the rows between 0 and I think it's -1. Okay, so I want it in the first row. Okay, still not enough detail for it to know that, okay, I want it row 1, which would be technically 0 to 1. And actually, technically, it should be 1 to 2. 1 to 2. Okay, and see, it moved it up, and didn't know which spot to move it up, so it just automatically moved it there. But let's say I want it over here. I can then get more specific and say grid column, and say, hey, I want it in the columns between lines, column-wise, I want it between lines 2 and 3. Okay, because this is line 2 here, this is line 3, so I'm saying, hey, I want it between lines 2 and 3, and between row lines 1 and 2. Okay, so I could define it that way, and notice that like that's fine, but you have to kind of think about all these numbers in your head. You know, you could actually give the lines names to make it a little easier. So I can go in here and use square brackets and say, okay, start, middle, and again, the names could be whatever you want, end. Okay, and I can do the same thing here. Start, mid, end. Okay, and now if I click on the grid, okay, I still see the numbers, but now I can actually use these names to kind of explain what I'm doing. So now I could still say, hey, here it's from start to mid, and this is from mid to end. Okay, and that still works. Okay, and again, if I wanted to move it back to the beginning, I could change this to like from start to mid. Okay, and it moves it back. And then again, if I want to move this back into the second row, I can say, hey, from mid to end. Okay, and then it moves down there. So I could just remember like the numbering, okay? Or I can actually give the lines explicit names if I want, and then use that to help define sort of where I want things kind of plopped in there. And it doesn't have to just be one square. You can actually say, hey, I want this div to take up, you know, lines 1 through 5. Okay, and it can take up multiple squares in the grid. You're defining sort of what chunk of the grid this thing is going to take. Okay, so this allows you to kind of define things any way you want. Okay, and that works really well. Although I find the different approach to grid much easier, and that's the grid areas approach. So let's try that out. So how does the grid areas approach work? So let's open up with Live Server. Once again, we start off with everything kind of broken up. So again, to change this into a flexbox, I just changed the container back to display grid. But instead of defining through lines, what you do is you actually kind of sketch it out. So you say grid template areas, because we're going to define areas. And you can have as many squares in that grid as you want. Just it has to be an equal number of, it has to be consistent. You'll see what I mean. So then what happens is you can then define the rows. Okay. So basically what happens is that every time I hit space, that's going to be a separate sort of square. Okay. But I'm going to give the areas their name. So exactly let's say at first what I want is I want 4 in the upper left, and then I want 2 in the upper right. Okay, so 4, 4, 2, 2, and then we'll say 1, 1, 3, 3, 1, 1, 3, 3. So now, basically what I've done, okay, and I think this might need quotation marks, actually. No. Okay, grid template areas. So essentially what I've done is I've defined a grid of 4 rows and 4 columns. And then I'm saying, okay, which in that grid of 4 by 4 grid, which squares in that grid belong to which area? So these 4 squares belong to 2. These 4 squares belong to the title 4. Okay, those are the area names. And now I can say, hey, I want the class of 4, I want it to be physically located in the grid by assigning it a grid area and say, hey, you belong in the area called 4. Okay. So right now it's still kind of confused. So we have to go make sure we add all these area names. Grid area 3. Grid area 2. Grid area 1. Okay, and that didn't quite come up with the area, so there's something wrong syntactically about the way I did this. I do think I need quotation marks. Let's do a quick look. Grid template areas. Okay. Yes, I need quotation marks around each row. So basically each row gets its own quotation marks. And there we go. So we have 4 rows that are represented like that. Okay, and now we get the effect that we wanted. Okay. And the cool thing is that now I can just, instead of me having to change this here, so for example, if I were to do a media query, so if I were to say, okay, at media minimum width 1000 pixels. Okay, and then I were to change like the container div, and I say, hey, you know what? When we're on a big screen, usually I would do this actually in reverse, where I would want the bigger screen to have everything kind of multiple columns, and then I would want the smaller screen, the mobile phone, to have sort of a single column design. But just to kind of illustrate this, let's say we want everything in one column as the screen gets bigger. So I can just change the grid template areas and just say, hey, I want 1, 3, 4, 2. So now basically what I'm saying is that, hey, when this media query kicks in, I want the grid to be just basically a 1 column 4 row thing, and this is where I want those grid area names to be located. So now if I scroll this up to make it 1000, so let's hit 1000 pixels, and there you go. See, now it's 1 column, and you see like the order, number 4 is the 3rd item, so it's following the areas that I had originally assigned to them. And then again, if I scroll this back in there, it's going to go back under and go back to the, so I can easily change the layout of the whole page and where all these physical areas are located really easy by just sketching out the areas. And that's a really nice thing about grid, because it makes the responsiveness and saying, hey, I want to switch from 1 column to 2 columns to 3 columns really, really easy. Okay, so this is really great for like the overall layout of the page. And then, you know, if one of those squares is a section where you display products, that's kind of like where I probably use flex. So oftentimes you're mixing and matching grid and flex to kind of get the effects you want. And oftentimes, you know, I might make all the elements in my grid flex items, because just even if I only have 1 child in my container, okay, Flexbox offers those really awesome justify content and align item properties that allow me to do that center and space between and justify all that stuff. So, you know, Flex is really great for alignment. Grid gives me really, firm control over where things are located. And they can be really powerful. And there's a lot more you can do with them, but hopefully this gives you a really good primer on using Flexbox and Grid and gives you sort of a visual sort of on how they behave. But with that, my name is Alex Merced from AlexMercedCoder.dev. Have a great day and enjoy.